There are moments in life that mark a before and after, moments that shake you so hard they awaken something inside you that you never even knew existed. My name is Hope Mendoza. I'm 68 years old, and my entire life I've been a woman who has made compromises for love. I gave in when my husband wanted to paint the house blue instead of green. I gave in when my son Edward wanted to study engineering instead of taking over the family business. And I kept giving in even after I was widowed, when loneliness began to weigh on my shoulders like a wet blanket in winter. My home in a quiet Chicago neighborhood has witnessed laughter, tears, celebrations, and goodbyes. Every corner holds a story. Every crack in the wall tells a secret. My Anthony and I built this house with the sweat of our brow. 40 years of work as a teacher at St. Martin's Elementary School. 40 years of saving every dollar, giving up vacations and luxuries just to have our own roof over our heads. Anthony didn't get to enjoy it as much as we would have liked. Cancer took him 5 years ago, leaving me with memories, with yellowed photographs, and with a house far too big for one person. When Edward lost his job at the construction firm, I felt it was a sign. My son, my only son, would come home with his wife Linda and my 2 grandchildren, Dylan and Sarah. I thought the house would be filled with life again, that laughter would return to these walls that had only heard the echo of my footsteps for too long. I prepared their rooms with excitement. I bought fresh flowers, baked homemade bread, and cleaned every last corner. I wanted them to feel welcome, to feel like this was their home too. The day they arrived, I hugged Edward tightly. He was thinner, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and the look of a defeated man. My mother's heart ached for him. Dylan, my oldest grandson, hugged me with that tenderness that always reminds me so much of his grandfather. Sarah, on the other hand, barely greeted me, too busy with her phone. And then there was Linda with her perfectly styled hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Thanks for having us, Hope," she said, in that voice of hers, sweet but cold as steel. "It will be temporary, of course. As soon as Edward finds another job, we'll get our own place." Something in her tone made me feel like a stranger in my own home, but I ignored it. These are difficult times for everyone, I thought. Losing a job can wound a person's pride, especially a woman like Linda, who was used to a certain lifestyle. The first few hours were a whirlwind of suitcases, boxes, and decisions about who would sleep where. Linda insisted on taking the master bedroom, the one I had shared with Anthony for 30 years. I didn't object. After all, they needed their space as a couple. I could sleep perfectly well in the small room overlooking the garden where I can hear the birds singing every morning. That first day, I prepared a special dinner. Beef stew with potatoes, my mother's recipe, the same one I used to cook when Edward was a little boy and would come home hungry from playing soccer in the downtown square. I set the table with my porcelain china, the one I only use on special occasions. I lit candles and even opened a bottle of wine that Anthony and I had saved for an important celebration. The family is together again, I thought as I stirred the pot. That's reason enough to celebrate. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called everyone to the table. Dylan was the first to arrive, helping me serve. Edward appeared looking tired, but he gave me a sincere smile when he saw the stew. Sarah sat down without looking up from her phone, and finally Linda appeared, her hair freshly done, and wearing a dress that seemed too elegant for a family dinner. I remember every detail of that moment, as if it were happening right now before my eyes. The steam rising from the freshly served plates, the aroma of fresh herbs from the garden, the clinking of silverware against the porcelain. Everything seemed perfect, a family scene, just like the ones I had dreamed of during my years of solitude. I was serving the last plate, my own, when Linda dropped her cutlery on the table with a sharp thud that echoed in the dining room silence. She stared at me, her dark eyes like 2 bottomless pits, and said the words that changed everything. "I'm the one in charge of this house now. Take your plate and go eat outside with the dogs." Time seemed to stand still. Dylan dropped his fork, which clattered against his plate. Edward went pale, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on his food, as if the stew had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. Sarah let out a nervous giggle, looking at her mother with a mixture of awe and admiration. And me? I felt as if a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me. It wasn't just the humiliation, though, that hurt deeply. It was seeing my son, my Edward, the boy I had raised with so much love, say nothing. He didn't defend me. He remained silent, accepting his wife, treating me like a servant in my own home. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have demanded respect. But in that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for a long time, woke up. A quiet strength, an absolute certainty of what I had to do. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or even resignation. It was the smile of someone who finally sees things clearly after being lost in a fog for a long time. I stood up calmly, picked up the cordless phone that always rests on the small table next to the refrigerator, and dialed a number I knew by heart. They all stared at me. Linda with defiance, Edward with shame, Dylan with sadness, Sarah with teenage curiosity. "Who are you calling Mom?" Edward asked, finally, finding his voice, though it was weak and trembling. I didn't answer. I waited for the person on the other end to pick up. When I heard the familiar voice, I simply said, "Gabriella, the time has come. Activate Protocol Sunrise." I hung up and sat back down at the table. I picked up my spoon and began to eat my stew as if nothing had happened. "What was that?" Linda asked, her tone not as confident as before. "Who did you call?" "A friend," I replied calmly. "You'll understand tomorrow. Now let's eat. The food is getting cold." The rest of the dinner passed in an uncomfortable silence. I could feel the confused stares, the tension building in the air, but I felt strangely at peace, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, while everyone was asleep, I went out to the garden and sat with my dogs, my faithful companions, who had never judged me, who gave me their unconditional love without asking for anything in return. I stroked their heads and whispered to them, "Things are going to change, my friends. Hope Mendoza has remembered who she is." And that's how it all began. With a humiliation, a phone call, and a decision that would change not only my life, but the lives of my entire family. Because what Linda didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I was already prepared for this moment. During the 2 years of his illness, Linda visited Anthony in the hospital exactly 3 times. At the funeral, she cried tears that never reached her eyes, accepting condolences as if she were the primary mourner. I saw her scanning the house with calculating eyes, while neighbors hugged me. After Anthony's death, the loneliness hit me like never before. It's one thing to be alone. It's another thing entirely to feel lonely. For months, the house felt too big, too quiet. The spaces we once shared were now constant reminders of his absence. His empty armchair, his side of the bed, cold, his coffee mug untouched in the cupboard. Edward would visit on Sundays sometimes with the kids, almost never with Linda. I noticed his concern, his glances assessing whether I could manage on my own. "Mom, have you thought about selling the house?" "It's too big for you," he suggested on several occasions. "You could buy something smaller, easier to maintain, maybe closer to us." I always refused. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the vessel of my memories, the last tangible link to Anthony. It was during those first months of grieving that I met Dolores Fisher at a support group for widows at the St. Martin Parish. Dolores had lost her husband 2 years prior and owned a small shop in the neighborhood. She invited me for coffee at her house, and there I met Gabriela Santos, her lawyer niece. That day changed my life. Dolores told me her story so similar and yet so different from mine. Her oldest son had convinced her to put the house in his name for safety, and 6 months later, he had her committed to a nursing home against her will to sell the property. Gabriela had rescued her legally, but the house was already lost. "We seniors are vulnerable, Hope," Dolores told me as she poured more coffee. "Especially women, especially widows. The world sees us as burdens, as incapable children, or as prizes to be divided up." That night I couldn't sleep, Dolores's words echoing in my mind. Would Edward be capable of something like that? I wanted to think not, but his insistent suggestions to sell the house took on a new meaning. And if not Edward, what about Linda? I had seen her look at the house with those calculating eyes too many times. The following week I visited Gabriela's law firm downtown. I told her my concerns, my fears. She didn't judge me. She didn't tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, she told me about similar cases she had handled of children who had dispossessed their elderly parents of daughters-in-law and sons-in-law who had taken control of properties. "Mrs. Mendoza," she said with a firm but kind voice, "love is wonderful, but a legal paper protects. Trust is not a document that holds up in court." And so the New Dawn Foundation was born with my house as its first asset and the life insurance policy Anthony had left me as its initial capital. Legally, the house was no longer mine. It belonged to the foundation with the condition that I could live there for the rest of my life as its director. Any decision about the property had to go through the board of directors: Gabriela Dolores, Father Michael, and me. Robert Gutierrez. My lifelong neighbor, a widower like me, found out about our project during one of our evening chats in the garden. Not only did he support the idea, but he became one of our main donors. "This is what Anthony would have wanted," he told me one day, "for you to be protected for your kindness to help others." In the following years, the foundation grew quietly. We helped 3 other widows protect their properties. We offered legal advice to dozens of seniors. We created a small emergency fund, all discreetly without publicity, without my family knowing. Not because I completely distrusted Edward, but as a preventive measure. "It's like an umbrella," I told myself. "You hope you don't need it, but you carry it just in case it rains." And then the storm came. Edward lost his job at the construction firm. The economy was bad. There were massive layoffs. At 42, with a mortgage, 2 teenage children, and an expensive lifestyle to maintain, my son suddenly found himself out of work. The Sunday calls became more frequent, the questions about the house more direct. "Mom, we've been thinking, the house is too big for you alone. We could move in with you temporarily until I find another job. It would be good for you to have company, and for us to save a little money." I couldn't say no. He's my son. My only son. And despite my reservations, the idea of having the house full again, of hearing my grandchildren's voices, excited me. Maybe everything would be fine. Maybe my precautions had been an overreaction. Protocol Sunrise was Gabriela's idea, a rapid action plan in case the situation became unbearable. A single call would trigger a series of legal measures designed to protect me and the foundation. I never thought I would have to use it, let alone on the very first day they lived with me. That night, after the disastrous dinner and the phone call, I slept surprisingly well. For the first time in a long time, I felt I was in control of my life, of my destiny. Linda's cruel words, instead of crushing me, had set me free. I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to put up with things just to keep a false peace. The next morning, as I was having my early coffee, I received a text from Gabriela. "All set, we'll be there at 10. I took my time getting ready. I chose my blue dress, Anthony's favorite. I did my hair carefully. I even put on a little makeup. If I was going to face a battle, I would do it with dignity. At 9:30, Linda came down to the kitchen already dressed and made up as if for an important meeting. She looked at me with some surprise, perhaps expecting to find me devastated by last night's events. "Good morning, Hope," she said in that falsely sweet tone of hers. "What's for breakfast?" "Good morning, Linda," I replied calmly. "There's fresh coffee bread in the bread box and fruit in the fridge. Help yourself to whatever you like." She frowned slightly, as if my lack of servitude bothered her. She poured herself some coffee in silence and sat across from me. "About last night," she began, not looking at me directly. "I was tired from the move, stressed about the situation. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." It wasn't a real apology. It was a justification. There was no remorse in her voice, only the convenience of keeping up appearances. Years ago, I would have accepted those empty words to keep the peace, but not anymore. "Linda," I said calmly, "we both know you said exactly what you wanted to say. What you don't know is that you made a serious mistake." She looked at me surprised. She wasn't expecting that response. Before she could reply, the doorbell rang. "That must be for me," I said, getting up. "I'm expecting visitors." At the door were Gabriella with her lawyer's briefcase, Robert with his distinguished air of a retired police officer, and the notary public Gabriella had brought to witness what was about to happen. I invited them in just as Edward was coming down the stairs, still in his pajamas, looking like he hadn't slept well. "Mom, what's going on? Who are these people?" "They're friends of mine, Edward, and they're here on legal matters that concern all of us. Why don't you wake up the children? This affects them too." The next few minutes were chaotic. Dylan and Sarah came downstairs sleepy. Linda demanded an explanation. Edward seemed lost. We all gathered in the living room, the room where we had celebrated so many Christmases, where Anthony and I used to watch TV holding hands every night. Gabriella took the floor professional and direct. She explained the existence of the New Dawn Foundation, my role as director, the legal status of the house. She showed the documents, the deeds, the bylaws signed and sealed years ago. The notary attested to their authenticity. In summary, Gabriella concluded, this property legally belongs to the New Dawn Foundation, with the condition that Mrs. Hope Mendoza resides here as its lifetime director. Anyone living in this house must either sign a lease agreement with the foundation and pay a monthly rent, or alternatively, they can vacate the premises within 30 days. The silence that followed was thick, almost palpable. Edward looked at me as if he didn't recognize me, as if I had suddenly become a stranger. Linda went from astonishment to fury in a matter of seconds. "This is a scam," she shouted. "Edward, do something. She's your mother, for God's sake. She's crazy. We have to have her committed." "Mrs. Orozco," Robert intervened with his calm but authoritative voice, "I suggest you watch your words. Everything Dr. Santos has explained is perfectly legal. The papers have been in order for 5 years long before you ever thought of moving in here." Dylan, my oldest grandson, sat on the sofa with an unreadable expression. His eyes went from his mother to me and then to the documents on the table. Dr. Santos had explained everything. Sarah, for the first time since they arrived, was not looking at her phone. She looked like a little girl again, lost and confused. "I don't understand," Edward finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, why did you do this? Why didn't you trust me?" His question hurt me more than Linda's insulting words. In his eyes I saw betrayal, as if I were the one who had broken an unspoken pact between us. "Son," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't about trust. It's about protection, not just for me, but for other elderly people who have been abandoned or mistreated. When your father died, I realized how vulnerable a single woman my age can be. I decided to do something about it to turn my situation into an opportunity to help others." "But you could have told me," Edward insisted. "I'm your son. I would never have hurt you." Before I could answer, Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Are you really that naive, Edward? It's clear she did all this because she doesn't trust us, because she's a manipulative old woman who would rather give her house to strangers than to her own family." "Linda, stop," Edward interrupted, but without much conviction. "Stop, stop." Her voice rose with each word. "We moved in here thinking we could save money, that we'd have a financial break while you found a job, and now it turns out we have to pay rent or leave. Do you realize what your mother has done? She has deceived us." "No one has deceived you," Gabriella intervened calmly. "You assumed the house belonged to Mrs. Mendoza personally, but you never asked. And let me remind you, Mrs. Orozco, that you were the one who told Mrs. Mendoza to go eat with the dogs yesterday. That doesn't seem like the attitude of someone who values and respects the person providing them with a roof over their head." Linda turned red, half from shame, half from fury. She looked to Edward for support, but my son seemed lost in an abyss of confusion and pain. "You have 2 options," Gabriella continued, professional to the end. "You can sign a lease agreement and stay in the house paying a monthly rent at market rate, or you can vacate in 30 days. The decision is yours." "How much would the rent be?" Edward asked, defeated. Gabriella mentioned a figure that, while fair for a house of that size in that neighborhood, I knew was beyond Edward's reach in his current situation. I saw his shoulders sink even lower. "This is absurd," he muttered. "We can't afford that. We barely have enough savings for a couple of months." "There is a third option," I said, then feeling I had to extend a hand to my son despite everything. "You can stay temporarily without paying rent, but with some conditions." Gabriella looked at me surprised. We hadn't discussed this possibility. "What conditions?" Edward asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Respect," I answered simply. "Respect for me, for my house, for my decisions. I am not a servant, nor a burden, nor an obstacle. I am the director of the New Dawn Foundation and the legal owner of this house. If you can accept that we can negotiate a temporary stay at no cost while Edward finds a job." Linda opened her mouth to protest, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "I need time to process all this," my son said. "Can we talk later, Mom? Just you and me?" I nodded. Gabriella left the documents on the table, including a draft of the lease agreement and a copy of the foundation's bylaws. The notary certified the delivery, and they all left, but not before exchanging a few words with me in private. "Are you sure about this, Hope?" Gabriella asked with concern. "After what happened last night, I don't think it's wise." "I have to give my son a chance," I replied. "He's not the one who disrespected me." "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," Robert muttered, who had always been protective of me, "and that tree has rotten roots." I thanked them for their concern, but assured them I would be fine. We agreed to stay in daily contact and that at any sign of trouble, we would activate the rest of Protocol Sunrise, a preventive restraining order, and my temporary relocation to Dolores's house. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. Linda locked herself in the master bedroom, refusing to come out even to eat. Sarah followed her, throwing resentful glances at me as if I had ruined some perfect plan. Dylan, however, approached me while I was watering the plants in the garden. "Grandma," he said softly, "I'm so sorry about last night. What Mom said wasn't right." I looked at him tenderly. Dylan had always been a sensitive boy, too mature for his age. He reminded me so much of Edward when he was young, before ambition, and Linda's influence changed him. "It's not your fault, my love," I assured him. "Adults sometimes complicate their own lives unnecessarily." "The foundation thing is incredible," he continued, sitting next to me on the wooden bench Anthony had built. "Do you really help other grandmas?" I told him about our work about Margaret, a widow who had been kicked out of her home by her son-in-law. About Albert, a widower who had been scammed by his own nephew. About Linda, who was sleeping on the street because her children had sold her house while she was in the hospital. Dylan listened fascinated, asking intelligent questions, suggesting ideas. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened with Edward and Linda, my grandson would be okay. He had Anthony's heart and perhaps a bit of my determination. At dusk, Edward finally came to talk to me. We sat in the kitchen, the space that had always been the heart of our home. I served him a coffee, just as I did when he was a teenager and would come to me with his problems. "Why, Mom?" he asked bluntly. "Why didn't you tell me anything about the foundation?" "At first it was just a precaution," I explained. "I saw stories on the news about seniors being scammed by their own children or abandoned in nursing homes against their will. Then I met Dolores and heard her story and other people who had gone through similar situations. I realized I could do more than just protect myself." "But I would never have done something like that to you," he insisted, hurt. I looked him in the eyes, those eyes so much like his father's. "Edward, when your father was alive, you came to see us every week. After he died, the visits became less frequent. There was always an excuse, work, the kids' commitments. I don't blame you, life goes on and you have your own responsibilities. But it made me realize how alone I was, how vulnerable I was. And yes, I also saw how Linda looked at this house, how she made comments about selling it, about it being too big for me. It wasn't hard to imagine what would happen if one day I couldn't take care of myself." Edward fell silent, staring at his coffee cup, as if he could find the answers to questions he didn't even know he had. "About last night," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "What Linda said wasn't right. I should have defended you." "Yes, you should have." I agreed not to punish him, but without sugarcoating the truth. "Your silence hurt more than her words." "Things haven't been easy lately," he confessed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded me so much of Anthony. "Losing the job, the mortgage, the kids' tuition. Linda is stressed, I'm stressed. We came here because we had no other choice, but I guess she saw it as an opportunity to, I don't know, take control of something in the midst of the chaos. I understand stress, son, but that doesn't justify disrespect. This house has been and always will be your home, but not at the cost of my dignity." Edward nodded slowly, as if absorbing for the first time the magnitude of what had happened and what was at stake. "What's going to happen now?" he asked. "That depends on you," I replied. "As I said before, you can stay temporarily without paying rent, but on the condition that there is mutual respect. Linda will have to apologize not just to me, but to the whole family for her behavior, and we will have to establish some basic house rules." "Linda isn't very good at apologizing," Edward muttered. "Then she'll have to learn," I said firmly, "or find another place to live." The conversation continued late into the night. We talked about his job search, about the kids, about the foundation. For moments, I felt like I was getting my Edward back, the sensitive and just boy that Anthony and I had raised. But I also saw the man trapped between his loyalty to me and to the woman he had chosen as his life partner. When he finally went to bed, I was left alone in the kitchen, with only the old wall clock that Anthony had fixed so many times for company. I thought of him, of what he would have done in my place. Anthony was always a fair man, but also fiercely loyal to his family. Would he have approved of my actions? Would he have understood my reasons? "Anthony," I whispered into the empty kitchen, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the day's events, wondering if I should have been tougher or more flexible. At some point, I heard angry voices from the master bedroom. Edward and Linda were arguing, their words muffled by the walls, but the intensity of their anger was clearly perceptible. The next morning, Linda didn't come down for breakfast. Edward looked exhausted, with deep, dark circles and a defeated expression. The kids were unusually quiet. The atmosphere in the house was like the calm before a storm. Heavy, oppressive, charged with electricity. "Linda says she'd rather leave," Edward announced as I poured him coffee. "She says she can't live under these conditions, that it's humiliating." I wasn't surprised. Linda had always been proud, incapable of admitting her mistakes or apologizing. "And what do you think?" I asked, preparing myself for any answer. Edward sighed deeply. "I don't know what to think, Mom. On one hand, I understand your position. What Linda did was wrong, and your conditions are reasonable. On the other hand, she's my wife, the mother of my children. We're going through a tough time, and I don't want to divide the family any further. Sometimes," I said, choosing my words carefully, "keeping a family together at any cost can do more harm than good. Respect must be the foundation of any relationship, Edward. Without it, there is only domination and submission." My son looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, or perhaps as if rediscovering something in me that he had forgotten over the years. "You were always strong, weren't you? Even when you seemed to give in to Dad. Even when you let us make our own decisions, even if you didn't agree. That wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength." I smiled, moved by his late but sincere understanding. Life has taught me that there are many ways to be strong, son, and sometimes the greatest strength lies in setting clear boundaries. That day, Linda packed her bags. She decided to go to her sister's house in another state, taking Sarah with her. Edward and Dylan would stay with me while he continued his job search. The farewell was tense, without tears or hugs. Linda barely looked at me, and Sarah gave me a cold kiss on the cheek at her father's insistence. As the taxi drove away, taking half the family with it, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I didn't want to be the cause of their separation, but I also couldn't continue to allow that kind of treatment. "Did I do the right thing?" I asked Robert that evening, who had come over for a cup of tea and to make sure everything was okay. "You did what was necessary," he replied with that quiet wisdom that always comforted me. "Sometimes those two things are the same. Sometimes they're not. But it's always better to live by your principles than to betray yourself to please others." The following days were a period of adjustment. Edward spent hours sending out resumes, attending interviews, making calls. Dylan volunteered at the foundation, fascinated with the idea of helping others. And I slowly reclaimed my place in my own house, my voice, my dignity. One afternoon, while Dylan and I were sorting donations for the foundation in the living room, Edward walked in with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time: hope. "I have an interview tomorrow," he announced, for a supervisor position at a new construction company. "The pay isn't as good as my old job, but it's a start." I hugged him, genuinely happy for him. Perhaps this crisis, as painful as it had been, would be the catalyst for a new beginning for everyone. That night after dinner, Edward handed me an envelope. "It's from Linda," he explained. "She asked me to give it to you." With some apprehension, I opened the envelope and read the letter inside. It was brief, just a few lines, but it took my breath away. "Dear Hope," Linda had written in her elegant handwriting. "Circumstances have forced me to reflect on my actions. I recognize that my behavior was unacceptable, and I apologize for the pain I have caused. I do not expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am working on being a better person, for Edward, for the children, and for myself. Sincerely, Linda." It wasn't a particularly emotional or lengthy letter, but coming from Linda, it was almost revolutionary. I looked at Edward, who was watching my reaction intently. "She's seeing a therapist," he explained. "It was her sister's idea. It seems this situation has made her confront some things from her past, from her relationship with her own mother." I nodded, not knowing exactly what to say. People are rarely complete villains. Most act from their own wounds, from their deepest fears. "Do you think we can ever be a family again?" Edward asked. And in his voice I heard the little boy who once asked me if the sun would come out again after a particularly bad storm. "Time will tell," I replied, putting the letter away. "But to rebuild, you first have to acknowledge what was broken, and it seems that process has already begun." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a full month since that first day when Linda ordered me to eat with the dogs. Spring was advancing in Chicago, painting my garden with colors and scents that always reminded me of Anthony. He loved this time of year when we could sit in the backyard and watch the flowers push through the damp earth, promising new life. Edward got the job at the construction company. It wasn't the executive position he had before, but it would allow him to start rebuilding his financial life. Dylan continued to help me with the foundation, showing a surprising sensitivity and maturity for his 17 years. We video chatted with Sarah almost every day. I noticed she was different, more thoughtful, less attached to her phone, and more present in our conversations. One particularly sunny morning while I was having breakfast with Edward and Dylan, the doorbell rang. It was Gabriella, my lawyer and friend, with an unreadable expression on her face. "Mrs. Mendoza," she said after the greetings, "I need to speak with you about an important matter, in private if possible." I took her to what had been Anthony's study, that small corner of the house where he kept his poetry books, and I kept my important documents. Edward watched us go, worry evident on his face. "What is it, Gabriella?" I asked once we closed the door. "You're scaring me." "A delicate situation has arisen," she explained, taking some documents from her briefcase. "I received a call yesterday from a lawyer representing Linda Orozco." My heart skipped a beat. Despite the apology letter, a part of me had always feared that Linda would try some legal action against the foundation or me. "What does she want?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "It's not what you think," Gabriella reassured me. "She's not here to claim anything. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Linda wants to make a donation to the New Dawn Foundation." I was speechless. Of all the possibilities I could have imagined, this was the last one. "A donation, Linda?" I stammered, unable to hide my astonishment. Gabriella nodded, just as perplexed as I was. According to her lawyer, she has sold some of her jewelry and wants to donate the money specifically for family mediation programs between senior citizens and their children or in-laws. She says it's her way of repairing the damage. I sat down slowly in Anthony's chair, trying to process this information. The Linda I knew would never have sold her precious jewelry, much less donated the money to a cause unrelated to her own interests. "How much?" I finally asked. $10,000, Gabriella replied. "It's not a huge amount for the foundation, but considering their current financial situation, it's significant. Her lawyer mentioned they were jewels her father gave her. Her father's jewels." Now I understood better. Linda rarely spoke of her family, but Edward had told me that her relationship with her parents had been complicated. Her father, a wealthy businessman, had lavished her with material gifts, but had been stingy with affection. Her mother, from what I knew, had been a distant and critical woman, obsessed with appearances. "There's something else," Gabriella continued. "Linda has requested a meeting with you, just the two of you. No lawyers, no family. She says she has something important to tell you in person." So, the mere thought of being alone with Linda sent a shiver down my spine. Our last interaction had been so unpleasant that the prospect of reliving it even under different circumstances made me anxious. "You don't have to accept," Gabriella clarified, seeing my expression. "I can politely decline the request or suggest a meeting with mediators present." I took a deep breath, remembering what Anthony always used to say. "Fear is natural hope, but don't let it stop you from doing the right thing." "I'll see her," I decided, "but here in my house, with Edward and Dylan present in the house, even if they aren't in the same room." Gabriella accepted my terms and promised to arrange the meeting for the following week. When we left the study, Edward was waiting in the hallway looking worried. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking back and forth between Gabriella and me. "Everything is fine," I assured him, "but we need to talk. Linda has requested a meeting with me." The news shocked Edward, who ran a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that always reminded me of his father. "For what? What does she want now?" he asked with a hint of bitterness. Despite the letter and the video calls with the kids, the relationship between them was still tense. I explained about the donation and the meeting request. Edward listened with an incredulous expression. "She sold her father's jewelry. I can't believe it. Linda adored that jewelry. It was her last link to him." "People can change, son," I said, though I had my own reservations. "Or at least they can try." The days leading up to the meeting were ones of preparation, both practical and emotional. Robert insisted on being present on the day of the visit, even if it was just in the garden pruning the roses. Dylan offered to bake cookies, remembering that Linda liked chocolate chip with walnuts. Edward fluctuated between hope and skepticism, unsure what to expect from this new Linda, who seemed to be emerging from the ashes of our conflict. The morning of the meeting dawned overcast with that diffuse light that softens contours and blurs shadows. I dressed with special care, choosing a light blue outfit that Anthony always said brought out the color of my eyes. It wasn't vanity. It was a way of arming myself with confidence, of reminding myself who I was and all that I had overcome in my 68 years. Linda arrived on time driving herself, instead of taking a taxi as we had expected. I watched from the window as she parked in front of the house. She looked different, less rigid in her movements, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate style she used to wear. She was dressed simply, almost austerely for her usual standards. Edward opened the door, his face a mask of studied neutrality. They exchanged a few words. I couldn't hear a brief hug that seemed more formal than affectionate, and then Edward led her into the living room where I was waiting. When our eyes met, I saw something I had never seen in Linda's eyes before: vulnerability. This was not the haughty, domineering woman who had ordered me to eat with the dogs. She seemed smaller somehow, as if something inside her had deflated. "Good morning, Hope," she greeted in a soft, uncertain voice. "Thank you for having me." "Good morning, Linda," I replied, gesturing for her to take a seat across from me. "Can I offer you some coffee or tea?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." Edward left to prepare it, leaving us alone in an uncomfortable silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Finally, Linda spoke. "I've been seeing a therapist." She began looking at her hands clasped in her lap. "At first it was at my sister's insistence, but then I started to see things about myself, about my patterns, things that aren't pleasant to recognize." I remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. What she was doing was not easy. I could see it in the tension in her shoulders, in the way she avoided my direct gaze. My mother, she continued after a pause, was a lot like me, or rather I became a lot like her, controlling a perfectionist unable to show vulnerability. She believed respect was demanded, not earned. She treated others the way she treated me. Edward returned with the tea, served it in silence, and left again, respecting our space, but staying close enough to intervene if needed. "What I did to you," Linda continued after a sip of her tea, "what I said to you that day, it was unforgivable. But it wasn't just about you. It was about me and my insecurities. When Edward lost his job, I felt like I was losing control of my life. Moving into your house, depending on your help, it made me feel small, helpless, and I reacted by trying to control the only thing I could, the space, the family dynamics. I made you the target of my frustration." Her words surprised me not so much for their content, but for their honesty. The Linda I knew would never have admitted weakness or error. "The donation," she continued, now looking directly at me, "is not an attempt to buy your forgiveness. I know that what I did can't be erased with money. It's my way of acknowledging the value of your work, of contributing something positive after so much negativity. The jewelry was important to me, but what's more important is trying to repair the damage I've caused." "And Sarah?" I asked, thinking of my granddaughter who had witnessed everything. "How is she?" Linda's expression softened as she spoke of her daughter. "She's fine. Better than fine, actually. This situation has made her see things too. She was starting to follow in my footsteps to adopt my attitudes. Seeing the consequences of my behavior was like a mirror for her. We are learning together how to be different." I took a moment to process everything she was telling me. A part of me, the hurt and cautious part, wondered if this was genuine or just a strategy to get back into the house without paying rent. But another part, perhaps the part that Anthony always encouraged in me, wanted to believe in the possibility of change. "Linda," I said finally, "I appreciate your honesty and your donation. The foundation can do a lot of good with that money. As for the rest, forgiveness isn't something that's given once and for all. It's a process both for the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven." She nodded, accepting my words without protest. "I don't expect us to go back to how we were before," she clarified. "Honestly, I don't think we ever had a real relationship, just a series of superficial exchanges marked by my judgment and your silent resentment. But maybe we can build something new, something based on mutual respect, for Edward, for the kids, and for ourselves." At that moment, Dylan came in with a tray of freshly baked cookies, his way of participating in this reconciliation. Linda looked at him with surprise and emotion. "Did you make these?" she asked, recognizing her favorite cookies. "With Grandma's recipe," Dylan confirmed with a small smile, "though I think I put in too many walnuts." "There are never too many walnuts," Linda replied. And for a moment, a brief, precious moment, we all smiled. The conversation continued more relaxed now, with Dylan acting as a bridge between us. We talked about Sarah, about school, about the foundation. Edward joined us eventually. And although the tension between him and Linda was palpable, there was also a tacit understanding, a shared will to find a way forward. When it was time to say goodbye, Linda approached me cautiously, as if afraid to break the fragile peace we had built. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening, for giving this opportunity." "Thank you for taking the first step," I replied. And on an impulse that surprised me as much as it did her, I offered her a hug. It was brief, awkward, but sincere, a small act of courage on both our parts. After Linda left, I stood on the porch watching her car drive away. Edward stood beside me silent for a moment and then said, "I've never seen her like that, so vulnerable." "Crises do that," I replied, thinking of my own transformations over the years. They force us to look inside ourselves and face what we find good or bad. "Do you think she's sincere?" he asked, doubt still present in his voice. "Time will tell," I answered, "but I believe she's making a genuine effort, and that itself is something valuable." That night, after Edward and Dylan had gone to bed, I went out to the backyard to gaze at the stars, something I used to do with Anthony on clear nights. I told him silently about my day, about Linda, about the small and large changes happening in our family. "I wish you were here to see it, my love," I whispered to the starry sky, to advise me to hold my hand as we navigate these uncharted waters. The wind rustled the leaves of the old orange tree, and for a moment I felt as if Anthony was answering me, as if he was telling me that I was doing the right thing, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the greatest of strengths. Robert found me there contemplating the stars. He had come to check that everything was okay, as he did every night since the incident. "How are you, Hope?" he asked, sitting beside me on the wooden bench. "Confused," I admitted. "Hopeful. Cautious, all at the same time." "That's natural," he said in his deep, reassuring voice. "You've been through a lot, and this situation with Linda is complicated." "Life is rarely simple, is it?" I smiled. "Rarely," he agreed. "But that's what makes it interesting. If everything were easy and predictable, where would the adventure be?" We laughed together under the starry sky, two old friends sharing a moment of peace in the midst of the storm my life had been in recent weeks. And for the first time since that fateful day when Linda ordered me to eat with the dogs, I felt that things might eventually be okay. I didn't know what the future held for our family, whether Linda and Edward would fully reconcile, whether we would all live under the same roof again, whether the wounds would heal completely or leave permanent scars. But I had taken a step toward forgiveness, not out of weakness or convenience, but by conscious choice out of a genuine desire to break the cycle of resentment and control that had marked our relationships. And that night, as the stars shone over my quiet neighborhood, I felt I had honored the name my parents gave me at birth. Hope. Because even in the darkest moments, even when all seemed lost, I had kept the flame of hope alive, the belief that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The following weeks passed with a strange sense of normalcy, as if we were all learning how to be a family again, but with different rules, with a greater awareness of our limits and vulnerabilities. Edward settled into his new job, coming home tired but satisfied each evening. Dylan continued to help me at the foundation, showing a natural talent for connecting with the seniors who came to us. And I, at 68, was discovering a new version of myself, firmer, more confident, but also more open to the possibility of reconciliation. Linda and Sarah remained in another state, but the video calls became more frequent and less tense. Gradually, Linda began to show a genuine interest in the foundation, asking about our projects, offering ideas from her background in administration. Sarah, for her part, surprised me one day by asking if she could come spend a weekend with me. "Just you, Grandma," she clarified over the phone. "I want you to teach me how to make those walnut cookies that Dylan loves so much, and I also want to talk about stuff." That stuff held much more than her words revealed. I knew it immediately. Sarah at 14 was in that difficult stage, no longer a child, but not yet an adult, where everything seems confusing and emotions are intense and overwhelming. "Of course, my love," I replied. "You can come whenever you want. Your room is always ready for you." When she arrived that weekend, I was struck by the change in my granddaughter. The teenager who had left with a frown and a defiant attitude had been replaced by a calmer, more present young woman. Her hair, once streaked with purple, was back to its natural brown. Her eyes, so much like Edward's when he was young, looked at me with a mixture of remorse and curiosity. "The house looks different," she commented as she set her small suitcase down in the room I had prepared for her. "Or maybe it's me who sees things differently now." "Perhaps a bit of both," I replied. "Houses like people change with time and experience." That afternoon, we baked cookies together, getting covered in flour, laughing when a batch came out, too brown, singing old songs I had taught her when she was little. It was in those simple moments, covered in sugar and the warmth of the oven, that Sarah began to open up. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said suddenly, as she shaped the dough, "for how I acted that day when Mom said those horrible things to you. I laughed. I shouldn't have." Her voice trembled slightly, and I could see she was struggling to look me in the eye. "You were a child following your mother's example," I answered gently. We all make mistakes, Sarah. What's important is that we learn from them. Mom has changed, she continued, or she's trying to. Sometimes she cries when she thinks I don't see her, and she talks about you a lot, about how strong you are, how you created something good after being widowed instead of becoming bitter. Her words moved me deeply. I never would have imagined Linda speaking of me in those terms, seeing me as an example of strength instead of a rival for Edward's affection. We are all more complex than we appear on the surface, I told her, wiping a bit of flour from her cheek. Your mother included. People aren't just good or bad, Sarah. We are mixtures of light and shadow, of strength and weakness. Like in that story you used to tell me when I was little, she remembered with a nostalgic smile. The one about the broken vase that was repaired with gold and became more beautiful than before. Kintsugi, I nodded, surprised she remembered that bedtime story. The Japanese art of repairing what is broken with gold, transforming scars into beauty. Exactly like that, my child. That evening after dinner, we sat on the back porch under the stars, wrapped in blankets, despite the mild weather. Sarah told me about her new school, about a literature teacher who had inspired her to write poetry, about her plans to study psychology one day, to help people like Mom and like you, Grandma. Like me? I asked, intrigued. People who have gone through difficult things but keep going, she explained, who use their pain to help others instead of becoming bitter. Her words, so mature for her age, made me think about how crises affect not only us, but those around us, especially the younger ones who watch how we respond to adversity. Before she left, Sarah hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you, Grandma," which was worth more than any formal apology. And she asked me a question that took me by surprise. Do you think one day you and Mom could be real friends? Not just tolerate each other for Dad and for us, but really appreciate each other. I looked into her eyes, those hopeful eyes, and I knew I had to be honest. I don't know, my love. Deep wounds take time to heal, but I believe we can build something new and valuable based on mutual respect. And who knows, maybe with time that respect will turn into genuine affection. She seemed satisfied with my answer, or at least hopeful enough to continue believing in the possibility of a mended family, different from the one before, but just as valid. The real turning point came a month later when Robert suffered a heart attack while working in his garden. It was Dylan who found him, who called the ambulance, who stayed by his side until the paramedics arrived. When I got the call, I felt the ground open up beneath my feet. Robert, my faithful friend, my constant support since Anthony's death, was fighting for his life in the hospital. Edward drove me there immediately. He drove in silence, respecting my anguish. In the waiting room, while the doctors worked to stabilize Robert, I felt vulnerable again, reminded of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. What I never expected was to receive a call from Linda just an hour later. "I heard about Robert," she said without preamble. "I'm taking the first flight to Chicago." "You don't need to come," I replied, confused by her reaction. "Edward is with me, and Dylan is too." "I know," her voice was firm, "but I want to be there. Robert was kind to me even when I didn't deserve it. And you shouldn't have to go through this alone." I didn't know what to say. The Linda I knew would never have taken an emergency flight to support her mother-in-law and an elderly neighbor. Yet 8 hours later, she appeared in the hospital waiting room with Sarah, both looking tired but determined. "How is he?" she asked, hugging Edward first, then Dylan, and finally, with some hesitation, me. "Stable but critical," I replied, still surprised by her presence. "The doctors say the next 48 hours are crucial." Linda nodded, and without another word took off her coat, folded it neatly, and sat down beside me. Sarah did the same on my other side, taking my hand in silence. And so we sat, an unlikely family united by a common concern, by a shared affection for a man who had been a silent witness to our conflicts and reconciliations. During the 3 days Robert was in intensive care, Linda never left our side. She organized shifts so someone was always at the hospital. She brought homemade food so we wouldn't have to eat from the bland hospital cafeteria. She even managed to get a nurse to let us see Robert outside of visiting hours. One night, while everyone else was dozing in the waiting room, Linda sat next to me with 2 cups of tea. "I couldn't sleep," she explained, offering me one. "And I thought maybe you couldn't either." I accepted the tea with a grateful nod. The exhaustion and worry had broken down the usual barriers between us, allowing for a conversation that would have been impossible under other circumstances. "I've always been afraid of getting old," Linda confessed after a silence. "Seeing Robert like this, so vulnerable, despite having been a strong man his whole life, it makes me think about my own future." "Aging isn't for cowards," I replied with a small smile, "but it has its rewards." Wisdom perspective, the freedom to finally be yourself without worrying so much about what others think. "You don't seem to be afraid," she observed. "Oh, I am," I admitted, "afraid of dependency, of loneliness, of becoming a burden to Edward or the kids. That's why I created the foundation, not just to protect myself legally, but to build a support network to feel like I can still contribute in some way." Linda was silent, reflecting on my words. Then, in an almost inaudible voice, she said, "I underestimated you. I thought you were weak because you were kind. I thought you were naive because you were generous. I was wrong. And I judged you," I acknowledged, "as someone purely selfish and manipulative. Without seeing that perhaps you were acting out of your own fears and insecurities. I was wrong too." We exchanged a look of mutual understanding, the first moment of genuine connection in the 20 years we had known each other. We weren't friends, and probably never would be in the traditional sense, but a mutual respect had been born, a recognition of each other's humanity beyond the roles of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law we had been playing. Robert survived weak, but determined to recover. He was moved to a regular room where we could visit him more freely. It was there in that hospital room, smelling of disinfectant and medicine, that something happened that would change the course of our family forever. We were all gathered, Edward, Dylan, Sarah, Linda, and I. Robert, pale, but with lively eyes, watched us from his bed with a tired smile. "Well," he commented, his voice weak, but his humor intact, "it took me having a heart attack to see the whole Mendoza family gathered together and at peace." We laughed because it was true. Despite the painful circumstances, there was something beautiful about all of us being there, worried about him supporting each other. "You should stay this way," Robert continued. "United. Life is too short to waste it on grudges." His simple but profound words resonated with all of us. Linda was the first to respond, surprising everyone. "You're right, Robert," she said firmly. "And that's why I want to propose something." She turned to Edward, then to me. "I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks about family, about what really matters, and I think we should try again, all of us together, but differently." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Edward asked, cautious but interested. "That we move back to the house," she replied, "but not like before. I propose we convert the house into 2 independent units. Hope would keep the ground floor, which is already adapted for her, and we would take the second floor with its own entrance. Each of us with our own space, our own privacy, but close enough to support each other. And we would pay a fair rent to the foundation as we should." Her proposal left us all speechless. It was practical, respectful, and showed that she had understood the core of the conflict, the need for independence and mutual respect. "What do you think, Mom?" Edward asked me. "It's your house, your decision." I looked at my family, these complex and sometimes difficult people, who in the end were my blood, my legacy, my reason for going on after losing Anthony. I thought about what he would have wanted, about what I truly wanted. "I think," I said finally, "that it could work, with clear rules, with firm commitments, with the foundation, always as the legal owner. But yes, we could try." Sophia's smile lit up the room. Dylan nodded in approval. Edward looked relieved, as if a weight he had been carrying was finally lifted. And Linda? Linda looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes when she looked at me before, genuine gratitude. "We'll seal this properly," Robert declared from his bed. "When I get out of here, we'll have a dinner all together in Hope's garden, and we'll toast to new beginnings." 3 weeks later, with Robert recovering at his home, we fulfilled that promise. The garden that Anthony and I had cultivated with so much love was filled with voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Edward grilled meat on the barbecue. Linda and Sarah set the table. Dylan and I put the finishing touches on the salad. Robert watched everything from his chair of honor, still weak, but visibly happy to see us together. As we sat down to eat under the Chicago night sky, surrounded by the scent of spring flowers, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't a naive peace born from the belief that all our problems had disappeared. It was a mature peace, aware that there would be difficult days, disagreements, moments of tension, but also certain that we now had better tools to face them. Honest communication, respect for each other's boundaries, and the willingness to forgive without forgetting the lessons learned. During dessert, Edward proposed a toast. "To Mom," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that true strength isn't in dominating others, but in staying true to oneself. To Linda, who had the courage to look within herself and change. To our children, who are wiser than we were at their age. And to Robert, our guardian angel, who almost had to die to bring us to our senses." We laughed and toasted, and as our glasses met in the center of the table, I knew that the terrible day Linda ordered me to eat with the dogs had been paradoxically the catalyst for something beautiful. A mended family, not perfect, not idyllic, but authentic and resilient. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, I went out to the garden to gaze at the stars one last time. I felt Anthony's presence beside me, as real as the flowers around us, as comforting as always. "We did it, my love," I whispered to the night wind. "Not as we expected, not without pain, but we did it. Our family is moving forward, transformed, but united. And I am still here, stronger than I ever imagined I could be." And as the night dew began to form on the flowers that Anthony and I had planted so many years ago, I understood that my name had never been more fitting. Because that was what I was. That was what I had always been. Hope. Not the blind hope that ignores reality, but the tenacious hope that persists in spite of it, that finds paths where there seem to be none, that transforms pain into purpose and wounds into wisdom. My son brought his wife to live with me. On the first day, she told me, "I'm the one in charge of this house now. Take your plate and go eat outside with the dogs." I smiled, picked up the phone, and made the call. And that act of dignity, that moment of quiet courage, changed our lives forever. My story began with humiliation and ended with reconciliation. A path I never would have imagined when Linda, my son's wife, ordered me to eat with the dogs on that first day they came to live in my house. But life has unexpected ways of teaching us, of transforming us, of reminding us who we really are. I am Hope Mendoza. I am 68 years old, and today I have shared with you how one moment of dignity changed the course of my family forever. When I picked up that phone and activated Protocol Sunrise for the foundation I had created years ago, I wasn't just protecting my house and my well-being. I was reclaiming my value as a person, my right to be respected in my own home. The New Dawn Foundation was born from my grief after losing my husband Anthony, but it became much more than legal protection. It became a purpose, a way to help other vulnerable seniors, a testament that it's never too late to reinvent yourself. What began as a precaution ended up being my greatest strength when crisis came to my door. My son Edward had to face a difficult choice between his loyalty to me and to his wife. I saw his pain, his confusion, his shame when he didn't defend me that night, but I also saw his growth, his ability to admit mistakes, to take responsibility. Sometimes children must remember that their parents are not just figures of unconditional support, but people with their own dignity and rights. Linda, who I thought would be my enemy to the end, surprised me with her capacity for change. Behind her controlling and dismissive behavior was an insecure woman marked by her own family history, fighting her demons in the only way she knew how. Her transformation was not instant or perfect, but it was genuine. Her gesture of selling her father's jewelry to donate to the foundation and her support during Robert's illness showed that people can change when they find the courage to look at themselves honestly. My grandchildren, Dylan and Sarah, learned lessons that books don't teach. They saw the consequences of disrespect and lack of communication, but they also witnessed the power of forgiveness and the possibility of rebuilding what seemed hopelessly broken. Dylan, with his natural sensitivity, found a purpose in the foundation that resonated with his values. Sarah, initially influenced by her mother's attitudes, discovered a new, more authentic and compassionate way of relating to others. Robert, my faithful friend, almost had to lose his life to remind us all of what is truly important. His heart attack, though painful, was the final catalyst that brought us together as a family. Sometimes we need to face the fragility of life, to value the connections we have, to let go of grudges that only consume our energy and peace of mind. The house, those walls that Anthony and I built with so much effort, went from being a battlefield to being a home again now for a mended family, transformed by conflict, but strengthened by reconciliation. The decision to divide it into two independent units perfectly symbolized our new relationship, close but with our own spaces, united but respecting each other's boundaries. This story I have shared with you is not just about a conflict between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It's about the power of staying true to yourself, even in the most difficult moments. It's about how an act of dignity can trigger unexpected transformations. It's about the possibility of healing deep wounds, not by erasing them, but by integrating them into a new way of being and relating. When Linda ordered me to eat with the dogs, I could have responded with anger, with tears, with pleas. But I chose quiet dignity, silent strength. I smiled, picked up the phone, and activated a plan I had prepared not out of distrust, but out of precaution. And that decision, that moment of clarity in the midst of chaos, changed the course of our lives. I'm not telling you it was easy. There were days of pain, of doubt, of steps backward. Reconciliation was not a single event, but a continuous process with progress and setbacks. But every step, every honest conversation, every boundary set and respected brought us closer to a more authentic, healthier relationship. Today, as I tell you this story from my garden, I can see Edward and Linda preparing a barbecue in the backyard. Dylan is helping Robert with his rehabilitation exercises, and Sarah is studying under the orange tree that Anthony planted when we bought the house. We are not a perfect family, but we are a family that has learned to communicate, to respect each other, to value the wisdom that only crises can teach us. And to you who have listened to my story to the end, I want to thank you for your time, for your attention, for allowing me to share this very personal experience. I hope that in my words you have found something that resonates with your own life, with your own struggles and hopes. If this story has moved you, made you reflect, or simply kept you company for these few minutes, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, Elderly Stories. Every week, we share stories like mine, testimonies from people who have faced difficult situations and found the strength to overcome them, to transform them into opportunities for growth. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to be alerted every time we post a new video. And if you can please leave a comment telling me what you thought of this story, if you've been in a similar situation, or what you would have done in my place. Your comments not only help me feel connected, but they can also be a light for other people going through difficult times. Liking this video is very important so that it can reach more people who may need to hear these words of hope and dignity. Sharing our stories is a way of building bridges, of reminding ourselves that we are not alone in our struggles. I also want to ask you for something special. If this channel has brought you value, if these stories have accompanied you in difficult times or made you reflect, please consider supporting us with a monetary thanks. This feature allows you to make a small donation that helps us cover production costs and allows us to continue bringing quality content daily. Your support, no matter how small, makes a huge difference in our work and allows us to reach more people with these stories of life and overcoming adversity. Remember to check out our other videos where you will find more testimonies like mine. Stories of loss transformed into purpose of crises, turned into opportunities of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in the most difficult moments. I am Hope Mendoza, and this has been my story. A story that began with humiliation, but ended with reconciliation, with a transformed family, with the discovery of a strength I never knew I had. Because sometimes it is only when we face our greatest fears that we discover who we truly are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until the next video on elderly stories, where we will continue to share stories that remind us that it is never too late to start over, to set healthy boundaries, to honor our dignity. Because as the name of this channel says, and as has been my experience when Grandma remembered her worth, everything changed.